I shall go unto the altar of God, to God who giveth joy to my youth. Today I would like to talk about the first steps on the path to esoteric Christianity. Many people think the first step is meditation, that esotericism is a path of magic and talking to angels. Now meditation can and is encouraged to be done alongside this first step. But most people, they don't take this first step, either because they think it's boring, or because maybe it's too mundane, or it's terrifying, or maybe because nobody ever told them this step has to happen. Esotericism, at its very root, is a path of individual freedom. And a path of individual freedom must begin by looking within the self to see what type of shackles, what type of chains we have that prevent us from attaining true freedom. True freedom, true self-determination, true liberty. Mystical theology refers to this as the purgative life, and we connect with this in the sorrowful mysteries of the Rosary. Now in the Rosary, each of the mysteries has something called a spiritual fruit. Each spiritual fruit, it pertains either to purging oneself of a vice or to increasing in oneself a virtue. In the 5 sorrowful mysteries, the spiritual fruits are the agony in the garden, gaining control over our lower nature, rather than letting our lower nature have control over us. The scourging at the pillar, gaining control over our physical urges. The crowning with thorns, gaining control over our thoughts and our emotions. The carrying of the cross, perseverance, the virtue of perseverance, that we don't give in to sloth or laziness, and we have the fortitude to finish what we start. And the crucifixion, mortification, death to self. Namely, that we die to the old person that we were, who is controlled by these previous vices, these previous biases, these previous ideologies, these previous urges. And as we die to the old self, we arise to a new self and to a new life. This takes some serious self-introspection. This takes looking deep within ourselves and asking some long, hard questions. It also involves looking to take care of ourselves physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. So questions we need to ask. Physically, we simply take a look at ourselves, assess our health, assess any particular habits we have. Do we have eating habits that maybe we shouldn't have? Are we hurting our bodies with these? I'm not saying to go vegetarian. I'm not saying to go full cleanse. Please don't get me wrong. I'm a meat eater myself. I love the stuff. What I am saying is, look at what we're doing, look at how we're doing it, and also look at the main thing. Am I eating these things? Or am I not getting enough exercise? Or am I drinking too much? Or am I smoking? Because these vices, because these practices, these habits have taken control of me? Am I hurting my body because I am not in control over myself? Or am I hurting my body because I'm choosing to hurt my body? I once knew a woman about 9 years ago. In her case, her son had died. Now this was somebody from a very well-to-do family. She was doing very well, very intelligent, very articulate, great people skills, great people sense. I mean, this is somebody who could have gone anywhere she wanted, been anything she wanted to be. The moment her son died, she went suicidal. She turned to drugs. She turned to a bunch of bad habits that I won't mention in polite company. And she went self-destructive, full-on self-destructive. So when I ask, are we doing certain things to our bodies because we're doing it on purpose? I actually mean it, because it does happen. So physically, we need to look to this, and we need to see, what can we do? What can we do to make our lives better? What can we do to be good to our bodies? Likewise, mentally, so many of us have gotten locked into a place where we can't see outside of our own little ideological box, to where we can't even admit to ourselves, hey, maybe I could be wrong about this. Maybe I could be doing something the same way over and over and over again, and maybe I'm not getting the results I want because I'm doing it wrong. We can't even admit that to ourselves. We're rigid. We're ossified. We're pigeonholed into these little boxes. And when we subscribe to an ideology to the point where it overrides logic and it overrides objectivity, what happens is that's a point of pride. That's a point of pride that prevents us from gaining the virtue of discernment. This is one of the reasons I say the first virtue on the path of return, i.e. the path of the esoteric practitioner, the first virtue is humility. Because humility is required for gaining discernment. And that discernment is how we can determine whether we're doing something wrong, whether there are holes in an ideology to which we subscribe, or whether we may be doing something right. And the rest of the world is telling us we're wrong and they don't know what they're talking about. I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just not saying it's not the case either. Now, I've written about ideology. I've written about unshackling ourselves from ideology and bias over on the Thavma blog. So I'll post a link there in the description. Let's talk about emotional. Okay, let's talk about the emotional aspect. Let's look into ourselves. And we have to ask, do I have urges? Do I have feelings that I can't quite get under control? Do I have feelings that I want to act on? And are these feelings dangerous? Are they bad for me? Are they bad for my neighbor? Are these feelings controlling me? Now, this is important, and in fact, the idea of urges and feelings controlling us, it has to go alongside the whole thing with ideology and bias. Because if we practice an esoteric path, if we practice a path where we deal with the supernatural, where we deal with spirits, where we hope we're dealing with angels, when we practice a path where we're doing this regularly, a path where we talk about developing psychic abilities, any bias that we have, any preconceived notion that we have, any half-truth that we cling to so desperately we become fanatical about it, that becomes a vector by which we fall into our own flights of fancy. We open up trapdoors underneath ourselves and we fall into those trapdoors. We fall into flights of fancy, we fall into delusion, we fall into believing half-truths and outright lies, and we can also make doorways out of ourselves for what some people call trickster spirits and for other entities that may not have our best intentions at heart. We open up a door to them. And so it becomes very important to keep an eye on our thoughts, to keep an eye on our level of objectivity, our level of open-mindedness, our level of self-examination. And I don't mean take this to the point that we rake ourselves over the coals every day, because that's just another ideological bias that we're putting all over ourselves. And it's one that doesn't work in our favor. In fact, that's known as scrupulosity amongst moral theologians. And it is something that's strongly discouraged. The open, objective examination is what we're going for. Now, once we know what's going on with the physical. Once we know what's going on with our mental state, we know what's going on with our emotional state. That's when we begin the work on the spiritual state. And this is the work of meditation. This is the work of spirituality. The work that, as Catholic theology refers to it, is the purification of the inner person towards the eventual union with God. Okay, I may be flubbing a few words. It's been a few years since I've read it. But that's the general gist of the definition of spirituality, the purification and sanctification that happens within ourselves in our journey with God through Christ. Now, how do we accomplish these things? For some of us, it may involve asking some very scary questions. Do I have a thing for children? Am I a serial killer? Do I have the potential for either of these things? Now, some of you might be laughing at that. But there are people out there who need to take a serious look and ask themselves those questions. Really, I'm trying to help people here. I'm not trying to make any room for ridicule or laughter. In fact, it's completely uncalled for. Now, and I say now a lot, don't I? But that's beside the point. What other things can we do? Some of us, we may find things inside of ourselves that we need to go and get professional help. We might need professional therapy in order to clear this up. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, if you can find a good therapist, if you can find somebody, please send me their contact information. I may need to give their name out as a referral to someone else someday. So for some of us, it may be therapy. For some of us, it may just be asking some really hard questions, and we may find something that we can clear up ourselves. It may even be a case of distraction. In the beginning, a case of distraction. Right? You don't want to suppress urges. You don't want to suppress habits. You don't want to suppress them. You want to overcome them. When you suppress them, all you're really doing is you're building up pressure. It's like shaking a bottle of soda over and over and over again. Eventually, if it was like one of the old glass bottles and you throw it, or eventually if you take the cap off of it, it explodes all over you. You don't want suppression because you don't want that explosion. You make yourself a time bomb waiting to go off. Instead of that, instead of going for that explosion, you want to gain control. Now, in some cases, it's just if you're in a situation where those urges come to the forefront. Like maybe there's somebody, you barely even know them, but you just want to throttle them every time you see them. Seek out a way to remove yourself from that person. Seek out a way to remove yourself from that situation. Seek out a way to remove yourself from the situation, and maybe later on you can be reintroduced to it. Once you figure out what's going on inside of you, and once you start to get a handle on it, start to gain control. Another thing, and this is one of my favorite methods. Okay, St. Ignatius talks about this in the spiritual exercises, is that at the beginning of the day, take a blank piece of paper. In fact, you can have a diary, a journal, a blank book for this. Take a blank piece of paper. And what you do is every time you commit whatever it is, feel this urge, or commit whatever act it is that you're trying to overcome, you make a mark on the piece of paper. Now, it can be a dot, it can be a hashtag, it can be a picture of a pony for all I care. I mean, do whatever it is that works well for you. You make a mark each time. Now, what happens is, at the end of the day, you count the number of marks. Now, what we're doing is we're starting to pay conscious attention to whatever it is we're trying to overcome. You see, the thing with habits, the thing with vices, is that they tend to be unconscious. They're subconscious. We don't really think about them. And as a result, we start doing them, we start acting on them or thinking on them without even realizing it. So, what happens is we start forcing our conscious mind to pay attention. That's why we're writing down these marks. As your conscious mind starts to pay attention, what you'll start to see happening, what most people will start to see happening is, right as this thought enters your head, or right as you're about to do something, you'll get to a point, now it may take 3 or 4 weeks. For some people it may take 3 or 4 weeks, for others it may happen within a week. We're all wired differently. But what will happen is you'll start to notice, hey, wait a minute, I don't need to do this. This is what I'm trying not to do. And so as a result, hopefully you'll start seeing fewer and fewer marks each day as you look at that paper. Now, if you end up not seeing fewer marks, I'm going to say after a period of 2 to 3 months, if you end up not seeing fewer marks, in fact, if you see more marks on the paper because your conscious attention is thinking of it more and you're being guided towards it more, that's when you might need to seek out some form of counseling. Be it a spiritual counselor, be it a priest or minister who has a knowledge of mystical theology, be it just someone you know that has a knowledge of spirituality and a knowledge of psychology. Share your issue with them. Share what's going on with them. Show them the paper. Show them this video if they ask you to. Just show them whatever it is they ask you to show them, and be very open, be very honest with them. The more you tell them, the more they'll be able to help you. And so we have techniques of removal from a situation. We have techniques of forcing your conscious mind to think on a situation, to make yourself go, hey, wait a minute. Where your conscious becomes the obstacle between your subconscious and doing the action or whatever urge it is that you're trying to overcome. And then we have seeking outside help in those cases where you need it. In fact, you may want to go and seek outside help to begin with. Get a spiritual director at the beginning of your path. That way, whenever issues arise, you'll have somebody who's there, Johnny on the spot, and they can help guide you through it. So we have a few methods here that can apply into life. Okay, and while you're working on this, it's also a good time it's also a good time to begin incorporating your spirituality into the program. So you basically have a way of working: physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. You're overcoming roadblocks that you may have, whether they were put there through upbringing, put there through earlier experiences, put there through things that happened to you, or things that you're subconsciously putting there. Okay, so you have a method of clearing roadblocks now. And in meditation, there are a few meditations that I recommend. Okay, now one recommendation I can never make enough is the Rosary. I always recommend the Rosary to people, especially if they're so inclined to it. Because what the Rosary does, it helps us focus. It helps us focus, not just taking us through the life of Jesus through the eyes of Mary, but it helps us to focus on the various virtues and the various vices that we're either seeking to increase or decrease. It helps us to focus on the spiritual fruit. And this right here, this can be used in conjunction with the paper I was mentioning, where you make the marks and pay attention to what you're doing. The trick is not to beat yourself up over it, but simply to say, okay, this happened, I forgive myself. Passive observation, passive acceptance, I forgive myself, I resolve to do better next time. That's one of the tricks. Now, another meditation which I teach my students, it's the first thing I teach them, is what I call the meditation on the divine presence. I include it in 3 of my books, namely The Magic of Catholicism, Ritual Magic for Conservative Christians, and Christian Spiritual and Magical Rituals. I included those books. I also have it on YouTube. I'll put a link in the description. And I believe I have it on the Favma blog. I can't remember offhand. If I do, I'll put a link in the description as well. Okay, so it's definitely out there. It's out there, it's accessible, so I'll put a link into that. So what we now have in front of us, we have a beginning sense of what we need to look at on the first steps in the esoteric path, be this esoteric Christianity or esoteric anything else, because all religions have an esoteric side to them. Okay, the first steps on the path, the types of roadblocks we need to clear from our path, the need to go inside of ourselves, possibly deep inside of ourselves, and ask really hard, really pointed questions. And then a plan of action for what to do about it, both in terms of curbing our vices and in terms of meditating to put ourselves in contact with our spirituality. I hope you find this video helpful. I'm hoping to produce at least 1 video per week on the subject of esotericism and spirituality. So by all means, stay tuned, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.